it hit me that this, is much, much more serious than just celebrating diversity. It touches on people's childhood. It touches on historical and personal trauma, the discrimination that she faced as a child when she moved from her village in the Andes to the city, and the kind of linguistic discrimination she faced. And just by speaking the language of her childhood, she opened up all of these sad experiences.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
Dr. Daniel Kaufman joins us to discuss New York City's Endangered Language Alliance.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelika Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. Today, we are joined by Dr. Daniel Kaufman. Dan is the co-founder and co-director of the Endangered Language Alliance, a nonprofit dedicated to documenting indigenous, minority, and endangered languages, supporting linguistic diversity in New York City and beyond.
We look forward to speaking with him about language documentation, community collaboration, and more. Welcome to Speaking of Language, Dan.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here.
So we always like to start off by asking our guest about their background and path with languages. So what is that for you?
Ooh, it's a tricky question. But yeah, I got interested, maybe obsessed with languages early on. I came from a multilingual household. My parents spoke several languages, but between themselves, Hebrew. And I became kind of fixated on language and linguistics in high school, actually, on reading one of the classic books called Language by Sapir, and then became more interested in the languages in my own environment. I became interested in Semitic languages more generally. Then later on developed a kind of fixation on Austronesian languages, the indigenous languages of the Pacific, most of the Pacific, that is. And then went on to specialize in those languages before I came to co-found the Endangered Language Alliance.
Awesome. Well, speaking of ELA, the Endangered Language Alliance, you are one of the founding co-directors. How did ELA come to be? What would you tell our listeners who have never heard about ELA if they ask what it is all about?
The Endangered Language Alliance is one of very few organizations in the world that is really dedicated to documenting and supporting linguistic diversity in the most general sense. And it's the only organization that really works in the city context, working with various diaspora populations of indigenous people and others on preserving their language. These are people who have been either forced to leave in one way or another, or came to New York for various reasons to improve their lives, but as a result have ended up cut off from their community in many cases, but also in many cases are wonderfully fluent and creative speakers of languages that are endangered.
Right. And so tell us about language documentation. I know this is a sort of sub-branch of the field of linguistics, and that it informs the work of ELA pretty profoundly. Let us in on that for those of our listeners who might not be familiar.
Sure. So language documentation is maybe a kind of a newer name for something that's quite old, but it became somewhat revived over the last few decades when it was realized that what we were calling language description was really not the same thing as language documentation. And now that we had the tools, digital tools, to record language, to archive language, and to share it with the rest of the world, that required a kind of different skill set on the part of linguists, and a different level of transparency also between descriptions and data. And so the language documentation movement, you can call it, was really based on increasing transparency on one hand, so that these various accounts of language structure would be more honest, and also on an ethical level, getting the data back into the hands of various communities from where the language comes from. So when we think about language documentation, the focus is always really on the primary data, as opposed to language description, which is a kind of abstraction, from data. So that's what it is. And at the Endangered Language Alliance, what we spend a lot of our efforts on is recording this data, you could say, through interviews, through storytelling, through all kinds of different ways of speaking, and making it available as directly as possible, with some annotation, translation, transcription, but with a focus on putting the actual audio and video out there.
What are some of the languages that the Endangered Language Alliance is working with? And I know that list is long, but are there specific languages right now that maybe you just more recently started?
Sure, yeah, there's always we're a very small organization, I have to say, but there's always a long list of projects that are on various front burners and back burners. I would say the most recent collaboration of ours has been with a single refugee from Afghanistan who speaks one of the Nuristani languages, which is the languages of this region that was kind of the last region in Afghanistan to be Islamicized. And they preserved this language that was very hard for linguists to classify. It was kind of in between the Iranian languages and the Indo-Aryan languages in that family. And so it was proposed that they really belonged to a whole different branch, a third branch of that family, which belongs to this larger Indo-European family. And it's a very remote region, and the languages are of extreme interest for historical linguists, but also, they're of typological and general interest. And the languages had barely been described. So there was just some very rough descriptions made 100 years ago. And just as of the last few years, there was a new effort of German scholars who've described it. But otherwise, strangely, considering the historical importance of the language, these languages have barely been described. So we've been working with this speaker who is a refugee from the Taliban, and she's been living here for just a couple of years, and we meet with her weekly to record stories and also to analyze the stories, more importantly, and kind of break them down word by word, morpheme by morpheme. Besides that, there's projects that we continue from the beginning of the organization with the Garifuna community, for instance, in New York, and the Mixteco community. My co-director, Ross Perlin, who's just has a recent book out called Language City that talks about the organization and linguistic diversity in New York City. He's been working on a language called Seke from Nepal. And so there's many others, but those are the first ones that I would say are the most active.
Yeah. Dan, how do you find the speakers of these endangered languages in the city? Do you find them? Do they find you? Like, how does that all work?
So we were quite lucky in the beginning of the organization. We were really trying to take the linguistic pulse of the city, and we would send students out, and we would go out ourselves to various neighborhoods with pads and asking people on the street, and kind of typical pounding the pavement survey work. But as I said, we got quite lucky, and there was an article that came out about us in the New York Times really early on. And then from that point on, people started contacting us saying that I have an uncle who speaks this language, I have a cousin who speaks that language. And so then it's been more or less a flood. But at the same time, there were certain gaps that we still continue to ask around, to go to community centers, restaurants, but now there's kind of a snowball effect that people know people who tell us about other people,
right?
And so we have a large network that we've compiled all of this information into a language map, actually, which is kind of what what we're known for, I guess, if we're known for anything. It's at languagemap.nyc. And that is, that displays graphically and gives a little background on every community that we've encountered in the city. And one of the most interesting things about it is how vastly different it is from the census data, which is really a pretty wild undercount of linguistic diversity.
Yeah.
And you can make direct comparisons between what we've found and what the census has recorded, for any neighborhood.
Very, very cool. And we will link that in our show notes. It's really fascinating to take a look at.
Oh.
Dan, you were saying earlier how you're a very small organization, but your work spans such a wide swath of areas, the arts, public programs, advocacy. How do you decide where and how to focus your efforts?
That's a good question. I wish I had a good answer to that. We're kind of lurching, I would say, from crisis to crisis.
Relatable.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we were working. I would say that the overall trajectory of the organization was that it really started out maybe more with an academic focus, and then as communities came to us and individuals came to us, we really very quickly kind of let those people, the collaborators from whatever community, take the lead. But then when we have such emergencies like the pandemic or now this war on diversity, these are things that we naturally respond to just as a matter of necessity. So during the pandemic, we got involved with all different efforts for both reaching out to communities that we'd been working with, but also creating materials in languages that there were no materials for.
So you just mentioned the war on diversity. Why should we celebrate multilingualism in a city like New York City or anywhere for that matter?
Well, yeah, the larger question of why should we celebrate diversity, linguistic diversity, period, and that is it's a reflection of human potential. It's what makes us uniquely human. Every language contains this wealth of information and artistic material within it, and so we're celebrating what it is to be human by celebrating language, and we're also celebrating the particular history and kind of cultural contribution of various communities. So, for me, it's so I guess basic and obvious that it's hard to formulate. But but that's bad because it's not obvious to a lot of people, of course, right? And many people see language just as a purely utilitarian thing that you use it to communicate. But those same people who say that we learn English to get ahead, everybody should speak only English, it's the language of the world. If tomorrow that was true for Mandarin and Mandarin became the language of the world and the way to get ahead, then I don't think those same people would be switching over to Mandarin so quickly.
Sure.
So, there's a lot of obviously bias and discrimination built into how people view language and whether diversity is something to celebrate or not.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another arm of language documentation, or we could say that language documentation is closely related to language revitalization. And that's something that's really been driven by communities for many decades now. In most cases, these are communities whose language has been taken from them through processes of colonization, mostly rooted in racism and the belief that their languages and their speakers were inferior. And so there's a lot of historical trauma involved in this. It's not just kind of a fun celebration of diversity. It's really righting a historical wrong.
Yeah.
And especially throughout the United States, throughout countries like Australia and that have really, Canada, Latin America that have really suffered the brunt of settler colonialism and language loss, there is a very, restoring the language is, to these communities, really undoing this trauma. So in these cases, language learning also takes on a slightly different or a very different relevance and a different face, really, because it's not just, how do I get around in the city? How do I, navigate a hotel?
Sure.
It's much
Right.
deeper than that, right? It's communicating with ancestors. It's unearthing knowledge that often that has been lost, and it has a spiritual aspect as well. So it's a very, very different. It's a very different kind of activity, and that was really at the Endangered Language Alliance. That really, from our very first interview, was something that really jumped out, because I remember the first time that we invited somebody to come up into our space and record a narrative. It happened to be, I forget even how they found us, but somebody had contacted us saying that her mom spoke Quechua and would like to record a story, older woman from Peru. And we thought, oh, great, how fun. We're recording our first narrative in Quechua, And here comes the woman with her mother, elderly mother, and we set everything up, we talk and all of this, and the mother starts to tell her story, and very quickly she starts to look, quite morose, and then next thing she's really crying and telling her story and crying and crying. And without even knowing what the story was about, I barely knew the people themselves. It hit me that this, is much, much more serious than just celebrating diversity.
Right.
It touches on people's childhood. It touches on historical and personal trauma. The story that she was telling was about the discrimination that she faced as a child when she, moved from her village in the Andes to the city, and the kind of linguistic discrimination she faced. And just by speaking the language of her childhood, she opened up all of this, all of these sad experiences that she passed through. So yeah. As much as we try to be involved in language learning, the kind of language learning involved in these cases is of a very different nature than the kind that we're engaged in when we try to learn French or Spanish as students.
Yep.
Amazing. Well, let's pivot from that. What are some successes you've experienced from Ella's work, and what results would you like to see in the future?
So I've said, from the beginning that the front lines in these battles to really preserve a language and keep it spoken among the youth is probably not in diaspora settings, unfortunately, right? That the communities, if they still exist intact, that those are the places which will really determine the future of a language. But from a diaspora perspective, there's a lot that we can contribute. And so the successes, I would say, are that we've had here at Ella are not only just documenting the existence of the languages and really showing them to city agencies and others that these communities exist here, but also documenting the languages themselves in a way that could be useful to children and the communities in learning the language. To me, that's really maybe the most important thing that we're doing, is trying to help parents transmit the language to children. For these many cases where there simply do not exist materials or spaces, right? With regard to space itself, this is the only real space where somebody who wanted to teach Garifuna or Mixteco or any other language, well, Garifuna, there is a community center where they've been teaching Garifuna, so I shouldn't say that. But for many languages, there is no space, there is no community center, there is no organization. And so we've served over the years as a place for language classes that have no other home. So for me, that's one of the more important successes, is creating this place where people can at least feel like, they can come here and feel safe to speaking their language and to pass on their language, and it's accepted and it's understood and it's something that's not, questioned by outsiders. And yeah, we're we're now known among at least many families and some communities as a place where that can happen. To the extent that our recordings will really be used in the future for language revitalization purposes, I suppose
Yeah.
only time will tell. It's much more than just hitting the record button and putting it out on YouTube or whatever. There's a whole
Sure.
process of socialization that has to happen, and getting the materials into people's hands, showing them how to use it, and so forth. So that's something that we're always working on and thinking about.
This is such important work that you all do. It's Yeah, especially right now, I think the point in time where we find ourselves, this is really wonderful. So you must be surrounded by so many different languages on a daily basis. How many languages do you actually speak, or how many languages can you listen in on?
Listening in. Yeah, I try to listen in a lot of languages. I don't know how much success I have in all of them, but um, I'm pretty fluent in English, Hebrew, Tagalog, Indonesian, and Spanish. Not as fluent, but I have no problem speaking Spanish. And then I listen in on all of these languages that I've worked on here at Ella, but I can't say that I can really fully understand any of them. And running speech, I understand the structures oftentimes, but I'm not really able to hold a conversation, embarrassingly enough, in many of those languages. But
Oh,
ask me
that's
in
still
5 years.
Yeah, there we go. I like it. Aspirational goals, totally. No, it's still an impressive array of languages that you just listed.
Well, Dan,
Yeah.
where can our listeners find out more about you, Ella, and the work you are doing?
Well, we have two websites, two and a half, I guess. We have, well, all right, let's call them three websites. We have www.lalliance.org, and that's our main website, where you see all of our activities, a little bit about various languages that we've worked with, the communities here. The website I mentioned earlier is languagemap.nyc, which is kind of another way of viewing our work, but it's a graphic representation of basically all of the New York City's true linguistic diversity. There's a third website, which I shouldn't really recommend to everybody, but for linguists maybe, or for those who are really interested in language documentation or language structure, we have a website where we have collected in a kind of more linguistic format all of the texts, not all of the texts, but many of the texts and lexicons and things like that. You could find a link to that on our main website, but that's kind of the more analytical, linguistic side of our operation.
Well, and I think it's so wonderful that you do speak to different groups of people as well, right? You're trying to document the languages, you're trying to build community, you're trying to make this space available for people in the city who are interested in preserving their language. But then you're also having this whole research arm. So if people want to throw all their money at you, how do they do that?
Oh, they can just go to our website and find the button about supporting our work, and they can make a donation, they can buy a t-shirt, they can buy my co-director's book, I believe, Language City. We have a print map that we give away for a donation of a certain amount. And so, yeah, I heartily recommend it.
Wonderful. Dan, before we sign off, we'd like to ask you for a word in a language you love, you are learning, you may want to learn in the future, that makes you feel good. What's that word?
Oh, no, I should have prepared for this. I knew you were going to ask it, and I forgot. I like a particular Garifuna word, wagubrigu, means our ancestors. I like the meaning, and I like the sound.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Together, it just makes me happy.
There we go. Can you say it one more time?
Wagubrigu.
Oh, that's nice. Love it. Well, Dan, thank you so much. Again, we so appreciate you taking the time to chat with us, and what you're doing is so important, and we appreciate you sharing all that with our listeners. And thanks again for speaking of language with us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, guys. Thanks so much for this excellent podcast.
Next week, we are joined by Monty Wilkins to learn more about Cornell's Language House.
Until then,
Auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
and follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelika Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.